Hi everybody. I've titled this video, How to Read Poetry and Why. You've revised your first papers, you're posting your discussion posts, and we're pretty much done with Module 1. Nice work. Now we're moving on to poetry. In my experience, many students approach poetry with a combination of fear and the belief that they just can't do it. It's just too hard. I hope that's not the case with you because I know you can handle poetry. But in case you're afraid, I want to talk to you a bit about how I think you can approach poetry profitably and well. I'll do this in a variety of shorter videos in Module 2. I don't want to overwhelm you with anything too long. In this first video, I want to talk about what poetry is, why it's one of the most beautiful things we can do with language, and how we might conceptualize the difficulty of poetry. In addition to watching this video, please read the chapter on poetry in Reading and Writing About Literature. Please also read the chapter titled Poetry, Reading, Responding, Writing that I've posted to Module 4, Texts for our course, under Poetry. Both these chapters define poetry, give you some great sample poems, and provide terrific ideas about how to make sense of them. So what is poetry? I'll start by saying what poetry is not. Poetry is not prose. What's prose? Prose is the regular language we speak every day. It's the kind of language we see in short stories. It's the kind of language I'm speaking right now. If we say something is prosaic, we mean that it's an ordinary, everyday kind of thing. I walked to work, grabbed a sandwich for lunch, went to the gym. It was a prosaic day, not a poetic day. Poetry is different. If we say, I raced to work, fueled by hopes for the future. My sandwich tasted like a king's feast. The gym guided my growth. My body is becoming like a beautiful god. Well, if we say that, we've definitely had a poetic day. Poetry uses language differently. Specifically, most poetry puts language into basic patterns. These patterns are generally organized through the basic unit of the line, the poetic line. Each line might have a certain number of syllables and a certain number of stresses. The combination of syllables and stresses creates what we call the meter and the rhythm of the poem. Ba-bump, 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 ba-bump. Lines are then grouped together into units called stanzas. Each stanza might have 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or more lines. Basically, stanzas are groups of lines within a poem that form a unit and that are separated off from other similar units by space on the page, usually by white space. So, for one example, let's take a look at Emily Dickinson's poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, on page 10 of Reading and Writing About Literature. I've got it here on the screen in the Word document. So, see how this poem has 6 stanzas? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah? 6 stanzas. Each stanza has 4 lines. In each stanza, the first line and the third line have 8 syllables. The second line and the fourth line have 6 syllables each. In each line, the meter is what we call iambic, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one. Let me read the first 2 stanzas in exaggerated fashion so you can hear what I mean. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. Okay, sounds terrible, right? Let me reread it, more beautifully, I hope, but still paying attention to the underlying meter. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. Yeah. Patterns like this don't happen by accident. The number of lines per stanza, syllables per line, the meter, it's called poetry. Kind of cool. When we talk about the arrangement of lines in poetry, we can use the word lineation. In poetry, it really matters where one line stops and another line begins. There's no such concern in prose. Who cares where one line ends and another starts in Cathedral or the Yellow Wallpaper? It doesn't matter. But it does matter in poetry. Therefore, when you're quoting poetry, it's essential that you indicate to your reader where one line ends and the next one begins. How do you do this? Well, Janet Gardner teaches you in Reading and Writing About Literature on pages 46 and 47. So make a note to yourself right now to review that section of the chapter before you start writing about poetry. And also note that on page 161 of the book, there's a sample essay on Because I Could Not Stop for Death. It's a research paper, and you'll be writing a research paper in this class. So take a look at it and get a head start on what I'll be expecting. What else does poetry do differently? It uses images, by which I essentially mean word pictures that make you visualize a thing or an experience very concretely. So in Reading and Writing About Literature, you'll find Shakespeare's famous Sonnet 116 about love on page 101. I've got it here in my Word document. In it, Shakespeare right here says, "Love is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come." And on it goes. Images, a lodestar, a ship in the middle of a storm, a rosy-cheeked lover. All these things represent love very concretely. By contrast, time carries a bending sickle. Could he be the grim reaper who sooner or later will cut all lovers down? That's how I read the image. Poetry uses elaborate comparisons. One of the most basic comparisons is a simile, that figure of speech that compares two essentially dissimilar things through the use of the words like or as. Go online to Reading, Responding, Writing About Poetry, and have a look at William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Again, I've got it here in the Word document. Let me read that first stanza. There's a simile in line 1. "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze." In that first line, the speaker compares himself to a cloud through as. I wandered lonely as a cloud. It might be kind of nice to think about yourself as a cloud wandering. When you run into similes like that, ask yourself, why is the poet making this comparison? Are the two things really similar? How? I mean, let's face it. A man isn't tremendously similar to a cloud. Yet on some level, the simile makes sense. Why does it make sense? That's the work of the reader, to figure that out. Many of the poems we'll read are lyric poems. Lyrics tend to be brief explorations of emotion or a state of being. Lyrics take their name from the ancient stringed instrument, the lyre. They were originally meant to be sung to music. There's an ancient connection, in fact, between poetry and music. You may notice that Reading, Responding, and Writing About Poetry includes the lyrics to Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska as an example of a poem, and we could do the same with many contemporary song lyrics. Lyrics tend to communicate the subjective or personal experience of the poet. But if it's the personal experience of the poet, why should anyone else care? Well, poets take on the role of exploring the subjective inner feelings of human beings. If we contemplate poetry, we're contemplating what it means to be human, to have emotions, to sharpen our power of appreciation. Also, the poet connects to the universal. The poet James Dickinson says that a poet is someone who notices and is enormously taken by things that someone else would walk by. One way of talking about poetry is to say that it notices the things the rest of us are too busy or too oblivious to notice. But those things that we normally ignore might be important. By encouraging us to slow down and think about them, poetry encourages us to be more attuned to the world around us, to live a richer, more examined life. We often feel starved for value in our lives. Poetry helps us find it. Poetry creates wonder. It helps us see the world afresh. In seeing the world afresh, we might better understand it. We might better understand our own position in the world. We might simply enjoy the world more. And that's a good thing in and of itself, isn't it? Now, I started by saying that poetry is difficult, and maybe that's true. Poetry suspends normal ways of using language, normal ways of looking at language. As such, it requires us to slow down, to read and reread. With a novel or a short story, language may have layers of significance, but most authors of prose use language to move the reader forward, to communicate meaning and plot, to get us to turn the page. By contrast, most authors of poetry, certainly most authors of lyric poetry, use language to get you to slow down, to attend to the sound, the form, the rhythms of words, to decode images, to notice patterns. Faced with poetry's difficulties, some readers say, oh, I hate poetry, it's BS, it's not for me, I'm turning off my brain and doing something else. Very sad when that happens. Fortunately or unfortunately, turning your back on poetry is not an option for you in this class. You're not required to love poetry, although I hope you'll enjoy at least some of what you read, but you do have to read it and grapple with it. A lot of your grade in this class will be based on what you write about poetry. You can only write insightfully, persuasively, and well about poetry if you actually understand what the poetry is saying and doing. So you have to tackle it. If you find it difficult, I understand. But firstly, I'll bet that as you begin to learn a few basic techniques for reading poetry, it won't be nearly as difficult as you fear. And secondly, difficulty is part of the territory in a college course. If it weren't difficult, why bother studying it? Tackling different forms of literature allows you to expand your mind, make discoveries, push your brain forward. That's why you're in college, to learn something you didn't already know when you started. So that's how I think about difficulty. It's worth it. When you find a difficult poem, it's going to take time to work through it, but it's worth it. For some reason, it's easy for us to understand this point about difficulty when we're talking about math or chemistry or economics or neural networks. But when it comes to literature, we expect it to be easy, and if it's not, we walk away. But why should a story or a poem or a play yield up its secrets without some work on our part? If a piece of literature is going to challenge the way we think, if a poem is going to shake up our relationship to language, our familiar, taken-for-granted friend, language, then of course it's going to present us with some degree of difficulty, and of course it's going to require work to get something out of it. In the next video, I'll talk about specific strategies for reading poetry, specific things to look for, specific techniques that poets use. But for now, I'm going to read one of my favorite poems, John Keats's When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, i.e., when I'm freaking out about dying. When I read it, maybe it'll be an example for you of the kind of pleasure and richness that comes to you through the study of poetry. And I'll also tell you a story. It's a story involving one line from When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. In fact, let's just go to the poem. It's the line, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance. It's a story about me from long ago when I was dating my first girlfriend. Her name was Anna, and she lived on a river in the middle of, she lived on an island in the middle of the Fraser River in British Columbia, Canada. To get to her house, you had to cross this river on a ferry. And believe me, if you ever want to grow up to be a lifelong romantic, make sure that the first person you ever date lives on an island in the middle of a river that you can only get to by ferry. So one night I was taking Anna back to her parents' place, and we got out of the car and stood by the railing of the deck on the ferry, and we looked up at the sky. The moon was bright and the stars were shining, and I said it reminded me of Keats's line, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance. So a few weeks later, Anna gave me a gift. She was a talented musician, still is, and she'd written a piece of music to be played on the piano. She titled it The Night's Starred Face, and to this day, it's still one of the sweetest gifts anyone's ever given me. Poetry was a way for Anna and me to experience beauty together, to feel closer as young people who liked each other a lot. It was an inspiration, too, for Anna to express her own creativity. It was great. It makes me think a little bit about Cathedral, actually, when the narrator's wife writes poetry to explain Robert's role in her life, to try to understand what he means to her. This is what poetry can do. By disrupting regular language, by using words differently, it can get us closer to levels of experience and truth that might otherwise elude our grasp. So for today, let's end with When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, written by John Keats when he was 22 years old. When I have fears that I may cease to be before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold, like rich garners, the full ripened grain, when I behold, upon the night's starred face, huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone, and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink.